And welcome back. This is lecture 4 of Computational Neuroscience, taught at the University of Waterloo, winter 2021. And the topic for today is regression. All right. Where are we sort of in the brain? We're still talking about neurons and particularly small networks of them. Actually, I think specifically very small networks of neurons. What we covered in the last class was sort of the first big boom of neural networks back in the 60s, which is focused around the idea of perceptrons, where we had a bunch of features, we added up a weighted sum of those features, and produced some sort of output, and that's sort of the foundation of all artificial neural network type stuff. And what I want to do today is kind of step back and look at that same thing in a slightly different way. So this is sort of the diagram that I used to depict the perceptron. You've got some sort of raw input. You've got some set of feature detectors, things that are doing some sort of computation on that input to produce some sort of value. And then you are doing a weighted sum of those features, applying some operation here to produce your output. So in the classic perceptron case, what we've got is all of our raw input is just binary data. They were just photodetectors that could detect, it's either bright or dark. That's all they were focused on. There was these feature detectors that were just doing very, very simple logic. In fact, a lot of cases it was just sort of, all right, is there light at any of these points? So it's just sort of a big OR operation across all of those, or some of them would be AND operations, just some sort of simple logic that is taking a bunch of those raw signals and turning it into one feature. And then once we've got all these features, we then do a weighted sum of those features, and we apply some threshold that says should our output be a 1 or a 0. So if our weighted sum is above some threshold, then produce a 1. If it's below, produce a 0. And we mentioned last class, at least, that these feature detectors, these things are needed in order to let this system do arbitrary operations, because there's definite proofs that as long as you've got enough of these simple logic feature detectors in this middle here, this system can do anything. And there's any possible operation you might want to do, from computing input to some sort of output, this system can do it. But as was pointed out, you might need a heck of a lot of features in the middle here. All right, so that's the typical perceptron. If we adjust things slightly, this might actually become something that might be familiar to some people. Just sort of slightly change this. I'm going to have my input be just scalar values. So instead of zeros and ones, it's now there's just a bunch of numbers. The numbers can be anything. So we've generalized this from zeros and ones, just a set of scalar values. And then instead of simple logic operations here, we're now going to do just simple mathematical operations, just general mathematical operations. So we've also generalized that a little bit. This weighted sum is staying as a weighted sum, and then instead of doing a threshold operation, we're going to do nothing at all out here. Is that potentially familiar to some people? This is a really weird way of depicting regression. Or something like, hey, I've got some function, some arbitrary function, and what this function does is map some sort of input x to some output y. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have some way of breaking down this function into smaller components. In this particular case, we're breaking it down into a bunch of polynomials. So x squared, x cubed, x to the fourth, and so on and so forth. And we're going to apply some weight on each of those polynomials. We're going to add up the result, and we're going to get the function we're trying to approximate. Okay. So the main thing I'm pointing out here is that these two things are structurally the same thing. So we should be able to use both of them to do things what we want. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So let's say I've got some input x, and I've got some target output y, or I guess t for target output, or sometimes y for the actual output of our system. And I've got these 3 points, and these are points that I would really like. For an input x of this, I would really like the output to be here. For an input x of this, I would like the output to be here. For xn, I want tn. Okay. And then what I want is to create these some sort of weighted sum, so that I want this y to be, as I said over here, it's some sum of weights of some underlying set of functions. So in this case, the polynomial functions, just doing a weighted sum of those. And what we're wanting to find me the weights that will make this red curve get as close as possible to these blue dots. Right? That's what regression is. Again, that's really similar to what we want these perceptron things to do. I've got some sort of desired given some inputs, I've got some outputs, I'm taking those inputs, I'm turning them into some set of features, and I'm doing a weighted sum of those features to produce that output. Cool. So, what's the standard way of doing regression? How do we find those weights is another way of doing that, another way of saying that. Find the weights such that output y is close to some target value t for all the different x values that I have. So I have lots of different x values, each paired with the corresponding t value. So that's one thing that I hit. That's the inputs and outputs that I want. And then I have some fixed set of functions, the features that I'm going to be using, and do a weighted sum of those features to produce my output. Now, how do you normally do this? Well, there's lots of different ways of thinking about it. One way of thinking about it is to make a big matrix that is for each of my data points. So say I have a data point that says, all right, for an input of 0.3, I want my output to be 1.3. I can say, okay, well, what do my features do for each of those, for that input? So if my input is 0.3, my first feature is and I'm using polynomials as my set of features, then that's going to mean that my first feature is 0.3 to the 0, that's a 1. The next feature is 0.3 to the 1, that's 0.3. 0.3 squared, that's 0.09, and so on and so forth. So that's what all of my features would do for each of those for that first input. For the next input, all of my features would be 0.7 to whatever. So those would give me one big matrix of what do my features do for each of my inputs. And then what I want is I want something that if I could take that matrix and multiply it by some set of weights. So what is the weight on my first feature? What's the weight on my second feature? What's the weight on my third feature? And what I really want is I would like, when I did that multiplication, I would get my target answer. Right? I would get this. This is the value that I want when I do that. That's target. So often people will set up that sort of matrix, and then the answer to find how you find your weights is, oh, okay, well, you just do some math. If you want this to happen. So one way to think about it is, hey, I have this equation solved for W, which is my set of weights. And this is just matrix math. Multiply both sides by the transpose of the F matrix. Now I have something that I can do an inversion of, or I can do a pseudo inverse of anyway. Multiply that by both sides, things cancel, and now I get that weights. That's one way to think about it. That's how I tend to think about it, because mathematicians will yell at me when I do it that way, and they'll yell at me for good reasons. The correct way to think about what we're doing there is what you really want to do is you want to minimize the mean squared error difference between what happens when you do this math. When you do F times W, you want to minimize the difference between S times W and T. So you want to minimize that difference. And then you take the derivative of this thing, you set the derivative equal to 0, that gives you your weights. That gives you the same answer. It's the same answer, but this is the correct way to do it. In any case, that's standard. This is least squares minimization, is this sort of standard regression approach. And if you do that, you can just sort of directly solve for these weights. And this is sort of in contrast to what we did with the perceptron case, where we did some sort of learning rule that would eventually get those weights over time. This is pointing out that, hey, we can just directly solve for this. And the so sort of a standard example of this sort of thing. Let's say we have this set of data here. This is the blue dots are the actual data that we have. The way we generated those blue dots is we started with the green curve. Say that's the sort of the underlying real thing that we're trying to, that's the underlying real signal. And we sort of sampled from that real thing and we added some noise. And that's how we got the blue dots. Okay. And if we then try to do this regression thing and we only have one feature, and that feature is x to the 0, and that feature is just a feature that just outputs a 1 all the time, then, well, the system is just always going to produce the same value no matter what x is. And so the best possible weight is the best possible weight that it will find, it's got one parameter figured out, that's the weight on this one first feature, and it'll find something, and that will be, unsurprisingly, sort of the mean of all of these blue dots. If I add a second polynomial feature, then that means I've got one feature that is just outputting a 1 all the time, I've got another feature that outputs x, because it's x to the 1. I do some solving, there's going to be two, I do the regression, there's going to be two weights that it's going to find, and we're going to end up with something like this red line. And that's sort of the best you can do with two parameters, with polynomial regression. And of course, you can do better as you increase. So if I go up to 3, then cool, all right, I'm getting a better fit because it's an okay estimate. Interestingly, it starts looking a lot more like the underlying green curve than the noisy measurements that we have. But then there's this standard problem with regression that if you increase the number of parameters too far, you get something like this, where I've got m equals 9, and now I've got something that perfectly goes through those blue dots. It does a gorgeous job of exactly going through those blue dots. That red line is a horrible, horrible estimate of the green line. What this is getting us into is something that's really deeply important with neural networks, which is the idea of overfitting. The idea that if you've got a lot of weights to adjust, you can, or if you have a lot of weights to adjust and you have some target data that you're trying to make the outputs become, you can very quickly and very easily get yourself in these sorts of situations where, hey, it's doing a great job of hitting your target data, but it's going to generalize horribly in the middle. All right, so as if, it's for new data coming in, it might just do a really, really, really bad job. And this is something that's going to come up over and over again with any sort of neural network technique. Okay. What can we do about this? Typically, when we're using a neural network, we're more interested in how well it's going to perform on unseen examples than unknown examples. If I just wanted a system that, hey, given this, I've got these blue dots, those are the things I want it to do, given this input, produce this output. If that's really all I wanted the system to do and I did not care what it did for inputs that are in between, then I could just make a lookup table. I could just memorize those things, pay everything that just outputs those. Right? I wouldn't need to go through anything fancy. Most of the time when I have a neural network, what I would really like it to do is I would like it to do something at least vaguely reasonable in between. Even though it's only been trained on this point and this point, do something reasonable in between. Don't do this. This is bizarre. Don't for an input of 0 output that, for input of whatever this is, and then output a huge number in between. That's just bizarre. So this means that most of the time when we're using neural networks, we're going to want to be worried about taking our data. So we've got some sort of data that we're training it on. We've got some sort of data of here's a set of input and output. And that's what we're going to make our neural network do. What we're going to probably want to do is both have data that we're going to train on, and then we're going to need some other data to test on. And if you train on, say, 80% of the data, and then test on another, so you just take the data that you have, split it up so that 80% is for training, 20% is for testing, then you're going to get something like this. So across the x-axis is as I increase the number of features. So in this case, I'm using polynomial regression, so I'm increasing the number of polynomials that I'm using, or the order of the polynomials that I'm using. And then on the y-axis, I'm plotting what my overall error is, so how close my lines are to the target data. But I'm going to separate it out. Even though I'm only training on the training data, I'm also going to look at how it's going to behave on the testing data. Right? And if I start with a very small number of features, then I'm just going to do a horrible job on both. The testing is always going to be worse than the training. That's just generally in principle, just because, hey, it's been trained on the training data, and so the testing data is going to do a little bit worse, at least, even if everything's fine. And what you'll generally find is as you increase the number of features, at some point we have sort of this plateau of, okay, we're not getting much better with the training data. And then at some point, the training data is going to get incredibly good, and at the same point, the testing data gets incredibly bad. This is sort of a common feature of almost every one of these every sort of neural network algorithm can have this sort of problem going on. And so if what we're really interested in is being good on new data, what we really should do is make sure that we pick a number of features that's in this range, not way the hell up here. Okay. Another thing that sort of helps deal with this overfitting. So here we have two examples where we still have the same number of features. We're still using m equals 9, so we have 9 features. But on the left we have 15 data points, and on the right we have 100 data points. And on the left, that's just what the solution is. It's just, oh, okay, this is the best job I can do of fitting a polynomial of order 9 to these data points. It's going to do something like that. If I give it more data points, I get something that's much closer to my green line. Again, the way we're getting these data points is we have some underlying green line. We're sampling from that green line and then adding random noise. So this seems to be something. So this again, the sort of lesson of, hey, having more data helps your systems. Even if you've got this, there's the same number of connection weights in both of these systems, same number of weights. Sorry, same number of weights in both of these systems. Having more data helps. Okay. Again, I sort of, when I was saying that, I switched from talking about weights to talking about connection weights, and that's because I do think there is definitely the very strong similarities to sort of things that are happening in this regression and what's going to happen in sort of these connection weight situations. Because again, we can think of regression as just adjusting these sorts of weights. If these features are being extracted out by something like neurons, and we're adjusting connection weights, then we're doing pretty much the same thing as regression. And we hit the same problems. So again, one of the things that the Perceptrons book was pointing out is you can have the actual magnitudes of your weights can go a little bit crazy on you. And this is actually a concrete example of that happening just with regression. Where, all right, for that fitting, I mean, this is the set of weights that come out as the best ways to fit those lines. There's a huge order of magnitude difference between these weights. If you're going to build some system that is actually doing this, is biology really going to allow you to have some connection weights of strength 0.35 and other connection weights of strength, the heck is that? That's 1 million. That's a little weird. There's a couple things, some other techniques. Certainly this sort of regression issue is very well known. Lots and lots of people study it and find ways to work with it. One extremely common thing to do is do regularized least squares. And one way to think about that is simply saying, all right, well, fine, if the weights can get ridiculously large, and the weights getting ridiculously large is part of what's causing these giant giant changes. What we can do is we can just simply say, assume the weights aren't all that big. Instead of finding the best fitting weights, the weights that fit best to these dots, let's also add in the assumption, oh, and my weights aren't all that big. Okay? So that's going to mean it's going to do a less good job of hitting those dots because we're adding in an extra constraint. But if that assumption is true, if the weights aren't supposed to be ridiculously huge, then we should do a better job of generalizing. And so that's what this, if when you do the solving, you add this sort of penalty term. Turns out that this is what the math turns out to, is you just, when you have this matrix you're about to invert, before you invert it, you add on the identity matrix scaled by some factor. And that factor is sort of how strong are you going to penalize large weights. And that turns out to be mathematically equivalent to having a, it's mathematically equivalent to having a penalty on your error function of having large weights. And it's also the same as assuming that your features have Gaussian noise in them. So those are all turn out to be equivalent statements. And so if you apply that, so here is that same fitting with no regularization, and 9 features, and this is where I was saying, look, we've got too many features, you're overfitting. If you turn on this regularization and add a little penalty, then, well, that's much better. Because it turns out for this particular function, it is a good assumption that your weights should be small. But of course, now you have this regularization parameter. Now you're like, well, now how do I set that regularization parameter? Again, you're going to have a difference between training and testing. If you leave the regularization parameter off, then that's like not having the regularization. So you're going to have exactly the situation we showed before, where you are amazing on your training data, you perfectly fit your training data, but you are horrible in your test data. And the general finding is just you're going to be able to increase that, and then all of a sudden, all right, somewhere in here, these all seemed like perfectly reasonable values for the regularization. We get good testing data, but if we again make the regularization too big, then both of them are going to get penalized pretty badly. Incidentally, and maybe we'll probably talk about this much more when we get into deeper neural networks, what is generally going to end up happening then, if you have the situation of, hey, you're splitting your training data and your testing data, and you're like, oh, okay, this here is a good value for my regularization. It has often become, it's very common nowadays to also have both a training data set and a testing data set and a validation data set, where what you'll do is you will use the validation data set to figure out where to set your regularization level before actually applying it to your test data set, because that way your testing is a little bit you're not using the same testing data over and over again. Separate issue, we'll probably talk about that more later in the future. The important thing here is there's going to be some level of regularization that is right for your situation. It's hard to know what it is, but you will generally find these sorts of trends across lots of types of data. Everything I talked about so far was using polynomials as the basis function for doing some sort of curve fitting. Okay. So again, I've got some sort of raw input data, that's x, and I'm going to turn it into a bunch of features, x squared, x cubed, x fourth, so on and so forth. So that's taking my input and turning it into this set of features over here. There's lots of other ways, and then building up my function, the function that my system is trying to approximate, or the data my system is trying to approximate ends up being a weighted sum of these polynomials. But there's lots of other things. There's lots of other what are called basis functions that you could use. Another common one is use Gaussians. Cool. All right. So here's all my different basis functions. Another one I might do is a bunch of sigmoids. Here's my basis functions. They're going to be good for different things. People might also have told Fourier. So you use Fourier basis functions, wavelets. Indeed, when you go ahead and look at some neural activity in some parts of the brain, you can even start seeing basis functions right out of there. So for instance, this data over here is a bunch of neurons. This is going to be rat. I don't remember where in the rat brain. Somewhere, probably rat cortex. I will double check that. Where as as you change the speed that the rat is running at, the neuron changes its firing rate. Okay? And so you can think of this as one basis function, and then you have another neuron that has this as its curve, and another neuron that has this as its curve. And if you wanted to compute some function of the running speed of the rat, you could use this set of basis functions to go add up something, and add some value, this curve times 0.3 plus this curve times 0.1 plus this curve times -3, and you would get a new curve that could be useful for something. So there would be some other function that would be there. Okay. So all of these are legit basis spaces, and you just go ahead and use whatever this technique is. And this is just a different example of, hey, here's a bunch of different features. Let me go ahead and do something with that. Now, there is a big problem with these features. You'll notice one thing that about all of these features that I've done so far is they've all been one-dimensional. Right? They've all been sort of, well, there's x, and you're computing some functions on x. So the speed that the rat's running with, or the speed that the rat's running at. What if my input is more than one number? What if my input is an image? What if my input is two numbers? What if my input is the speed that the rat's running at and I don't know how bright the light is in the room? What if my input is an image? That's got huge numbers of dimensions, huge numbers of values. And this is the curse of dimensionalities, sometimes how this is referred to, is if you really want to be able to do something with more than one value. So if I've got one value coming into my system, and I'm turning it into a bunch of features, then I might turn it into the features x to the 0, x to the 1, x to the 2, x to the 3. That's the polynomial basis space. If I've got two values coming in, I might choose x to the 0, x to the 1, y to the 1, x squared, y squared, that's all fine. Oh, but I probably want x times y. X cubed, x squared times y, this starts growing really quickly. What if I have 3 variables coming in? What if I have 4 variables coming in? All of a sudden, the number of features expands out hugely. This is exactly the same problem that was being pointed out in the Perceptrons book, saying, hey, look, where do we get these features from? We might need a heck of a lot of them. As an example, there's a standard neural network test case where you're trying to recognize handwritten digits. These inputs are 28 by 28 pixel images. So that is 28 times 28, that's 784 inputs. And you want me to make features in 784 dimensions? Whereas in like 2 dimensions, it's already getting ridiculous. How am I going to make all these different features? Output of human retinas is roughly in the order of something like 2 million pixels. This is a problem. This is now starting to require way more features than there are neurons in the human brain. If we're just going to do something like what we did in the polynomial case of just saying, look, here's a set of polynomials. I don't care what function you have. I can use a set of polynomials to approximate any function. If I start trying to do that in a high dimensional space, I have serious problems. Okay, so what was the point of all that? The point of all that was to take perceptrons and relate them to something that might be a little bit more mathematically tractable or mathematically familiar, which is regression, and point out that all of the same problems apply, because in a certain sense these are identical systems. I've got some sort of input, and converting it into a bunch of features, I'm doing weighted sums of those features. And we're going to need something to solve these sorts of scaling problems. If we want to do regression on large systems, equivalently, we're also going to need to solve these scaling problems if we want to do neural networks on these large systems. Random project, as always, I want to finish off every lecture with random project ideas. So a couple that came to mind for this was just using regression to solve standard neural network tasks. It's not a particularly common thing for people to do. There's a whole bunch of standard neural network tasks out there, and it's often surprising how well just something simple like regression can do on those tasks. And then, of course, there's a little bit of hand designing you can do to sort of say, okay, well, what if we change the choice of features? And sort of exploring that. Cool. So that would be some possibilities. But what will happen next class, because this was sort of the state of the field, 50s, 60s, 70s, and then in next class we'll point out an interesting learning algorithm that is going to start telling us where we can get these features from. And that'll get us into the whole realm of backpropagation learning. Cool. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.